Jeff has not come from an academic background into holism and into Smuts's life. Jeff actually discovered Smuts by trying to address a problem as an executive, a senior executive in the business world. And in finding that they were talking about holistic solutions, he thought, what does that mean? And in his inquiry into it deeply, he found that what they were suggesting, what was generally spoken about, was not what it actually was. He started discovering a depth, and he decided that it was his duty to bring that depth to the world. So Jeff is actually close to, we're holding thumbs, Jeff, crossed fingers in England, close to publishing a book on his findings into Smuts's intended sequel and what he really meant by holism. So with that brief introduction, Jeff, you are so welcome, and we look forward to spending this time with you and having a conversation afterwards.
Thanks very much, Claudius. It's a privilege for me to be here tonight. It's nighttime where I am. I don't know where everybody else is in the world. It's really an honor to be able to present the findings of my research, which I'm now in my 12th year, and I still haven't published. I was hoping to publish my work to coincide with the centenary celebration, but alas, it wasn't to be. But I'm nearly there. Yeah, it's also an honor to be able to talk. This is the first time that I'm talking about my work in public. I haven't shared it with anybody in a public forum before, so this is the first that you're going to hear about it. It's also an honor for me to be presenting. I see that Professor Dupassani is here, and it's an honor for me to be able to share my work with one of the foremost scholars on Smuts. So for me, that's a great privilege. So thank you. You already mentioned the history. I read Smuts 35 years ago to do with trying to solve a cost management problem in the business world, where people speak about you've got to look at things holistically. And what does that mean? Looking at things holistically means taking everything into account, but it didn't solve that problem. And so I looked up the word holism for the first time, and I found the 1926 insertion, the dictionary insertion of what holism was, a tendency to make holes in the universe. And that certainly had nothing to do with looking at things holistically in a business world. And so on my retirement from the corporate world, I decided to research Smuts in more detail. And I read him again. And I read about, he mentions in the preface to the first edition and in the third edition, he promises a sequel. He promises to one day write about applying holism to the higher spiritual interests of mankind. I thought that is something I want to understand. And so I embarked on a project which has cost me a lot of time, a lot of money, but so much pleasure. It's also living a life with Smuts. My wife I think she's on here, I can't see her, has lived with me for the last 12 years now. I've been working on my project with Smuts. And it took me to the archives, the National Archives in Pretoria, where I have I've got 20,000 digital images of the Smuts papers in my possession. And I have read every single essay, book, article, speech that Smuts has ever written. So having said all that, I haven't got a lot of time, and it's going to be quite difficult to try and condense 12 years of research into 45 minutes. I'll do my best. So I went into the archives, and as I say, I read every single thing about Smuts. I found that he did in fact start a sequel. Between the years 1928 and 1932, he wrote several papers and some chapters to a book that he had in mind. They deal with the application of holism to science, further application to science and psychology in particular. I'll be publishing these unpublished this unpublished material. I'll be publishing some of it in my book, and I won't be dealing with that tonight. I'm dealing with the search for the higher spiritual interests of man. Mm-hmm. So I took the title for my presentation, Towards a Spiritual Worldview, from a speech, a draft speech that Smuts made as the president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1930. It was actually in 1931, but he wrote this in 1930. And the title of this draft speech was Towards a Spiritual Worldview. And that's where I've taken the title of this talk tonight. And he had a friend that he passed the draft speech to, a friend in the science community, who said to him, this title is not a suitable title for the president of an association of scientists. So he changed the title, but he didn't change the content. He was disappointed, but he wasn't surprised, because the message that he wanted to give the science community was that science had been making enormous progress, and that science itself was moving towards a spiritual worldview. When Smuts had discovered and understood relativity theory and quantum theory, things were becoming, in his interpretation, more spiritual, because those are invisible things. So he wanted to give this message to the science community about science themselves are moving towards a less mechanistic, analytical view of the world because of the new space-time, new discoveries in science. And the message was that despite this progress, the scientists themselves didn't understand the consequences of their own findings. So I used this as a title because I think it speaks to the sequel that he wanted to write in terms of the higher spiritual interests, which I'm going to share with you. So after all my reading, I realized this, that in fact, Smuts wasn't going to write about the higher spiritual interests of man. He had already done so. And he started that journey at the age of 16. That was the big aha moment. Once you've read all the Smuts papers, you realize that actually what is most revealing is that when Smuts started out in his first essays, he's in search of God. And I have all the evidence to back me up. So you might think I'm crazy, but this is where Smuts started, in a search for God. But it wasn't just the conventional God. It was a new idea of God that he was in search for, a new idea of God. And why? Why was he looking for a new idea of God? Because he thought that science and evolution This is the young Smuts now, not young Smuts, the young person of 17, 18, and 19 years old, thinks that science has destroyed the spiritual of man, the spirituality of man. It's all science's fault, because the man used to turn to the Bible to understand the origins of the Genesis. Man turned to the Bible for spiritual comfort, but no more. Man is now looking to science for all the answers of where we come from, why we're here, the meaning of life, and Smuts is very unhappy about this. This is not what he is celebrating at all. So he's looking for a new idea of God to compete, so to speak, with science. He wants to find an idea of God that is scientifically can stand up to scrutiny and match science in understanding nature. So I've already gone off my track that I've made notes on, so I'm definitely not going to finish this in 45 minutes. So religion had its problems, and it couldn't answer the spiritual questions that Smuts thought were necessary. Science certainly couldn't, of how we should live. So he also saw that science also had its own problems. Science was mechanistic, analytical, mechanistic, and it couldn't understand nature with that scientific frame of inquiry. So he had a framework where he was going to find a solution for religion and a solution for science. And he searched for this God, this new idea of God. When you read all the papers, you realize that his discovery of holism was actually incidental. It was by the way. He comes across holism by the way. It will all become clearer as we go through. So Smuts needs a new idea of God to restore the spiritual faith in religion, and he needs a new method of inquiry for science. And he finds his answer in his own understanding of nature. Smuts found the answer to understanding how to inquire into the world through his own understanding of nature. He learned to understand nature from his intimate companionship with her. And these words are not mine. Companionship is a word that Smuts carefully chose because it has far more depth than just to say a relationship with nature. Companionship with nature and a relationship with nature are two different things. You can have a relationship with your wife and never really connect deeply enough to experience what Smuts meant by a companionship of nature. Smuts treated nature as his closest companion. These are not my words. These are Smuts's words. He treated plants and trees and mountains as his brothers and sisters. Again, these are expressions which I've taken out of these letters. The intimate rapport with nature, Smuts says, is one of the most precious things in life. Nature is indeed very close to us. He says sometimes perhaps closer than hands and feet. That is in Holism and Evolution. that expression, if you've read Holism and Evolution as many times as I have, you will find it there. Nature is closer than hands and feet. For we are indeed one with nature. Her genetic fibers run through all our being. Now, when he speaks of brothers and sisters and hands and feet, that's not metaphor. As much as we would think Smuts speaks in metaphor, which he does, but that doesn't mean that's no metaphor, because that there, right there, is a theory of evolution. Because what he's speaking to is the common origin that we share, that he shares with his brothers and sisters, the plants, the trees, the mountains. That's what he means. He's talking to evolution. He's talking to the commonality. So keep that in mind. Smuts was a deeply spiritual person. You can't count the number of times he uses spiritual in his speeches, in his letters, and certainly in his books that he wrote. So the important point is to note that his spirituality is underpinned, it was nurtured by his companionship with nature. And a little later, we will get to how he speaks about understanding nature. I'll deal with that just now. Okay, so it's in this companionship with nature that Smuts first experiences, and the key word is experience, what it means to be spiritual. He felt nature to be alive as he was alive. And he came to sense that nature had a point of view, just like he had a point of view. Smuts had learned to speak nature's language. Again, this is not an interpretation, if I can just keep on reminding everyone. I am extracting Smuts's language from his writings and using his language to present the interpretation here. At the age of 17, he writes to his girlfriend, I.C. Krige, who would then become his wife. He points to a poem by Shelley, and he said to her, "Would you hear how nature speaks?" Nature taught him that there was more to the world than the eye could see, and that the visible world was merely an expression of a deeper invisible power, an invisible inwardness. He learned that from nature. This deeper invisible power is Smuts's language. Beautiful. Smuts found a word for this, to express this invisible power. He referred to it as the unseen. He got the sense of the unseen from his deep reading of the Bible. I won't get into the actual biblical portions, but I have it. But he got, as I say, he got the sense of the unseen from his biblical readings, but he got the actual word from Shelley, the poet. And he used the word unseen throughout his life to express that invisible power. He would say that the unseen is the real heart of the seen. It's taken me so many years to absorb that and understand him. I have it now, but that's what he said. So when Smuts wants to express his spiritual point of view, he speaks like this. He says, the unseen is the real heart of the seen. As he grew older, this early experience of the unseen and his close companionship with nature deepened his conviction that reality was much more spiritual than material. This is key to remember. It's a key point to remember. That was, if you ask Smuts, what do you mean by the spiritual? He would say the invisible power behind the scene. That's what it meant. That reality to him was more spiritual than material. That epitomizes his spiritual point of view. So he's now in search. He's in search of God. He's looking for God, and it's not surprising that he starts looking in nature for a new idea of God. All religion pointed to unity, but a belief in the unity of a supernatural God rested on blind faith, according to Smuts. Smuts wanted a new idea of unity that could be discovered in nature itself. So he's addressing the religious problem. Unity is in front of him. Religion speaks about unity. That defines religion for him. But blind faith in a supernatural God doesn't suit him anymore. And he's quite young. He's still at Stellenbosch. And he's now writing on these lines. So, where does he start? He starts with man. Was not man closer than his hands and feet to nature? Was not nature closer than hands and feet? So his first essay, he writes, he's still at Stellenbosch, it's in 1889. He writes an essay in Dutch called Homo Sum, which is, I think it translates into I am man. I must just check again. I am man. Here he finds that the highest manifestation of truth, and by truth he means unity, lies in the person, in man's personality. Here he's looking for an example of unity or truth, and he's looking at the personality for that example. Can real truth or unity or agreement be found in law or in personality? In other words, he's saying, if we're going to sign an agreement, a legal agreement, what's more important? The signature to the agreement or the spirit of intention behind that agreement? That was the essence of what he was trying to say in his Homo Sum essay, which was actually an essay about slavery, but like Smuts did, he always diverted and found a reason to talk about unity. So he concludes and says that personality is above the law. The personality has real power, an invisible power, and that's where the truth lies. That's where unity lies. And he coins a phrase in Dutch, invloedswet, the law of influence. And he describes it as a universal moral law from which we can derive our idea of God. That is now the first time he's 19 years old. And in this essay that he's writing, he's pointing to a new idea of God, a God that can be defined in terms of the personality and the power of the personality to influence. Man's influence on man has a spiritual power. If that, which is an invisible power, that to Smuts has elements of divinity. So he speaks of an idea of God derived from the law of influence. He's 19 years old. It's incredible. In the same year, in 1889, he writes another 2 essays. I have them here. Never before seen or spoken about. One essay is titled, The Gods See Everywhere. The other one is on Christian religion. In both essays, there are indications that the idea of a supernatural God no longer makes sense to Smuts. But the spiritual message of Christianity is more important than ever. So he doesn't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. He wants to retain the spirituality of Christianity, but he cannot accept the supernatural God, the God that handed Moses the Ten Commandments. So, he leaves Stellenbosch and he arrives in Cambridge in 1891. Remember, this is a journey with Smuts. It's a journey to find God, a new idea of God, to solve a science problem and a religious problem. Keep that in mind in case you think that I'm just wandering off. I'm trying to stay on that track. So he gets to Cambridge in 1891, and he's influenced by writers that resonate with the same spiritual point of view that he's got. So he reads Goethe, Spinoza, Whitman, Hegel, Schelling, and many others. But there's a pattern. When you look at who he was reading, there's a pattern that connects. Can't get into that now. In 1893, heavily influenced by Whitman, Goethe, and Jesus, he starts a book titled Cosmic Religion. This is before Whitman. He starts a book in 1893 called Cosmic Religion. And it's interesting in this that he uses Whitman as a savior from his puritanical way of life, not yet as the personality that he was going to study. That's still to come. So he's already using Whitman in his Cosmic Religion to help him address this rejection of the supernatural God, because he was a very pious young man, and this was really radical stuff in the 1890s. Cosmic Religion, he sets out in such a way that he solves both his problems. In one word, he solved his problem with one word, and that word was synthesis. He refers to God as the supreme principle of synthesis. That's his definition of God. A God who has a tendency towards unity. By synthesis, he meant, of course, that if you want to understand nature, you've got to look at her as a whole. So he rejects analysis. So synthesis is the opposite of analysis. He has now found a method of inquiry for science in the word synthesis. And he has God who has this synthesizing process towards unity. You can start to pick up the hints of where he's going. God is the supreme principle of synthesis. It's incredible then that he's already talking about God as a process, if you read it carefully. But so he has an epiphany, actually, one of his many, and he says, well, if God synthesizes, that is, if God makes wholes by synthesis, and science synthesizes in order to understand nature as a whole, then synthesis as a process of God and synthesis as a method of science all point to the whole. They all involved with the whole. So he realizes during the writing of Cosmic Religion that he needs a theory of the whole. If God is making wholes and science is trying to understand wholes by way of synthesis, he needs a theory of the whole. So what does he do again? It's now a few years later since he wrote Homo Sum in 1889. What does he do now? Of course, he turns to personality, because he was already talking about personality as the supreme principle of unity back in 1889. So he goes back to his idea of personality. And he reckons that if personality is the highest form of unity, surely it must be the supreme example of a whole. Because what is a whole if not an example of unity? Does that make sense? And if the personality as a whole is a perfect expression of unity, and if God is meant to be a supreme example of the one, of absolute unity, from which all things are derived, then voila, he has found God in the whole. He's found God in the personality. The question then for Smuts is, how does he prove that? How does he prove that the personality is a perfect example of unity? And now for another, I haven't published my book yet, and I'm revealing some really, really important information here. I'm sure Professor Dupassani will appreciate some of this. This was a fantastic discovery that I'm about to tell you about. He reads another German philosopher by the name of Rudolf Eucken, Eucken, 1846 to 1926. He reads Eucken's books that are written in German. Smuts read the German, and he made 50 pages of notes on Rudolf Eucken. And in these notes, we find that Eucken gave full explanations of a personality as a whole, what it means to define a personality as a whole. And he gives Smuts several ideas to work with. This is a key finding as far as I'm concerned, and I'm an amateur historian. I declared myself an amateur historian, and as an amateur historian, this is a key finding. Guided by Eucken, he then scraps his book on cosmic religion, and he now decides to write a book about the evolution of the personality to prove the idea of the whole. You see the thread. It's, if you're not following me, I accept. It's taken me 10 years. So in modern terms, all that Smuts is saying is that he needs a method to show how someone, anyone, any personality thinks and sees the world holistically. How to prove that someone thinks holistically. I'm using the word holistically, and I'm using the word holism well in advance of him discovering holism, but I'm doing that to make the modern language easier to follow. Otherwise, we'd be using the word whole. And I find that to understand how a person sees the whole is not as clear as saying a person that can think and see the world holistically, I think makes more sense to us now. And this is another important finding. Who does he choose as his first study to study the personality? Now, if you've read Smuts, you'd say Whitman. It wasn't Whitman. It was Jesus. His first personality he chooses to conduct his study of the personality was Jesus. But he didn't have a method. He didn't have a method yet. So the notes that he made here were incoherent, a little convoluted. He comes up with some terrific expressions, which I won't share with you now, but he scraps the idea of using Jesus as the example of the personality as a whole. And he develops a method first. before he selects his prominent personality to study, he develops a method which he calls the evolutionary method, a method of synthesis. It's clear that Smuts's understanding of evolution at this early stage was not the evolution of Darwin by natural selection. He was thinking of evolution more as a method of synthesis, a method of change and development. So that aside, he develops this method of evolution. He uses this method of evolutionary synthesis to study the development of a person's life experience in order to show how that person synthesizes their experience into expressions that will reveal their holistic thinking. That was his method. Or in the language of 1893, how these expressions of experience reveal the idea of the whole. That was the language he used. The process is completely subjective. It's wonderful that a 23-year-old can even think up something like this. But he wrote with such objective force and confidence that it's pretty convincing. His method is pretty convincing. So his plan to find expressions of holism requires him to now read the books, the poetry, whatever you can find to read about a prominent personality. And he's going to use his method to search out expressions of holism. And by that, he will then discover the whole in the personality. I'm glad you're shaking your head with some acknowledgement, Claudius. How am I doing for time? I've still got so much to say.
20 minutes.
Keep going. Keep going.
Okay. This this system of this method of trying to understand the personality and expressions of holism to prove the personality as a whole would ultimately become his mature method of personology, which he describes in Holism and Evolution. And when you examine the text of Holism and Evolution, you find it coming out of the Walt Whitman study in 1894. It's incredible. Okay, let me not divert. So he chooses Walt Whitman, but not after really having a good look at Goethe. He really wanted to do Goethe before Whitman. But he says himself that the amount of information on Goethe was just too much to read. And I suspect, this is now me speaking, I suspect that he had, because he was already had this little relationship with Whitman and Whitman's idea of God, I think that convinced him that Whitman was the person, because Whitman was telling him, was already indicating to Smuts, this is the kind of idea of God he was looking for. So he writes the Whitman book, the study of the evolution of personality, Walt Whitman, in 1894, 24 years old, and he proves the idea of the whole as an expression of Whitman's personality, and from that he derives the idea of God. And he goes to a lot of trouble in chapter 7 of the last chapter of Whitman's book, where he explains how he derives the idea of God from the idea of the whole, which is the personality as the whole. Smuts can therefore now claim that if Whitman's personality is a whole, or a perfect expression of unity as a result of synthesis, then by deduction, God must be the cause of that unity. And if God is the cause of that unity, then not only is the whole divine, but the personality as a whole is divine too. Where before he said that God was the supreme principle of synthesis, he now can confidently say that God is the supreme principle of synthesis that makes wholes. He's now proven it. When Smuts says, as he does in Whitman's book, that God is the spirit of the whole, he also means that God is the proven synthesizer of wholes. God as the spirit of personality. He had developed a suspicion of Jesus's divinity, evident from his essays, in a supernatural sense. But now, after his Whitman study, he felt justified in regarding Jesus as the supreme example and expression of what constituted a holistic personality. I'm getting into deep waters here. Huh? He now believed, with Whitman in support, that all self-conscious humans were divine. This is my own comment that I'm going to make because I know Smuts so well. I have to add, but just that some were more divine than others. The formulation of his idea of God was the climax of his book on Whitman. It's set out there. When you study the book on Whitman, he had one intention, and that was to prove the idea of God from the idea of the whole. His entire book was written for that purpose. So he kills two birds with one stone. He solves the problem for religion and for science at the same time. Not only had he derived the idea of God from the idea of the whole, but he also had demonstrated that the whole is revealed by a process of synthesis. And if the whole is revealed by a process of synthesis, that means that science can confidently use synthesis to understand the whole. Smuts therefore found for science a new method of inquiry, synthesis, and for religion, a new idea of God. All derived from the idea of the whole proven to exist by a process of synthesis. And so, in his mind, science and religion find common ground. They both agree on what constitutes a perfect unity. Science studies the formation of unity in nature. Religion interprets the supreme unity as God. If you follow the logic so far, then you have beaten me by 10 years. The whole is an expression of unity for Smuts. And what else is God meant to be but other than an expression of unity? So God and the whole are blending into one. He calls God the spirit of the whole in his Whitman study, but there's a dualism there that is still nagging him. There's God animating the whole. He still has a dualism and it's nagging him. It's nagging him. I'm going to leave that there and I'm going to move on. This, well, let me just say that nagging dualism is solved when he has an epiphany on board ship in 1909 on his way back from Britain. I'll deal with that if there's time. So he tries unsuccessfully to get his book published, his book on Whitman published, because really, if you think about it, that idea of God in 1894 was pretty radical. He returns to South Africa from Cambridge in September 1895. And over the next 4 years, he's involved. He writes a lot of articles and for newspapers, etc. He practiced law briefly in Cape Town. And then he moved to Johannesburg in 1897. He married Icy Kricher. And in June 1898, I'm just giving a quick overview of those years, those intervening years. He's appointed state attorney of the South African Republic under President Paul Kruger. In the early part of 1899, he returns briefly to the study of personality, and I find another unpublished paper titled A Theory of Personality. A month before the Boer War breaks out, he's writing. He's now state attorney. He's busy with all sorts of things, and he's still writing an article or writing a paper on the theory of personality. The important point to make is that in all his writings, whether political, military, or personal, they always underpinned his spiritual point of view. He was always appealing to the spirit in man to do the right thing. A contract may bind people legally, but cannot unite them spiritually. That was his theme. Whether he was making a speech to kings and queens, that was always his message. The unseen spirit was the real heart of the agreement. His spiritual point of view helped conclude the Treaty of Vereeniging, but that same spiritual point of view failed at Versailles. And that is my own poetic expression to give some force to how severely Smuts was affected by the failure of the peace, the peace failure in after the Great War. So in 1904, after the Boer War, I find 120 pages of notes that Smuts starts to make in a notebook, where he begins studying the idea of the whole and personality. These first notes are all notes that are leading to his inquiry into the whole. So he actually starts his inquiry into the whole, which he writes finally over a period from 1904 to 1912. He didn't just sit down in 1911 and write a book after the unification of South Africa, which he was intimately involved in. Throughout all of that period of time, and he's busy, Professor Dupasani will be able to explain better than I can what he was involved with politically over the years from 1904, after the Boer War, to unification in 1910. He was a busy man politically. Yet you find 120 pages of notes during this time. It's incredible. In 1905, Smuts meets a very important person in his life, Margaret Clark, later would become Margaret Gillett. They became friends for life. Margaret had come to South Africa in 1905 to assist Emily Hobhouse in helping the Boer women in home industries, etc. I'm sure the story is well known about Emily Hobhouse. Margaret came to help Emily Hobhouse, and they became intimate friends, platonically intimate friends. Margaret came from a family of Quakers, and the Quaker inner light idea definitely resonated with Smuts. But please let me say right now that that wasn't Smuts's idea of God. The Quaker inner light is a God up there felt within. Smuts's God, he was an expression of God. So we can revisit that later if there's time. But it's fairly common to think that he adopted the Quaker way. It resonated with him. He first met Quakerism with Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman came from a Quaker background, but he could see that in Whitman went beyond Quakerism. So that's just a side issue. Margaret was the person that introduced Smuts to a very important poet, William Blake. And William Blake played a significant role in Smuts's thinking, and he used William Blake's poetry, The Human Form Divine, to support where he was going, the divinity of the personality. Blake, Whitman, Smuts, Spinoza, same idea of God. In 1909, Smuts reads Spinoza again, and he has another epiphany. He becomes a disciple of Spinoza. But again, let me just say, don't fall into the trap of thinking, oh, Spinoza, pantheism, Smuts, pantheism, everything in God. Absolutely not. Smuts, in his 1899 essay on Homo Sum, let me read this out to you. And just a note that what I'm reading in English was translated by the biographer Levy, who wrote a biography on Smuts in 1917. That's the only thing I have not been able to locate, is that essay written in Dutch. So I'm relying on Levy's interpretation and translation from Dutch into English. And I'm using that translation when I say on behalf of Smuts, where Smuts says, we do not believe in pantheistic oneness, if that means the disappearance of the individual into the all whole. So in another conference, another session, we can talk about all of this. It's just never going to be enough time. But Spinoza gives Smuts the direction he was looking for. Spinoza's natura naturans, natura naturata. Smuts has an epiphany. And on the 12th of September 1909, on board the RMS Confounds, and I have this document here, on their stationery, the ship stationery, he writes here, on the 12th of September 1909, and he says, there is no spirit of the whole apart from the whole. The whole is spiritual. That meant that he had discovered holism right there. Because where he was before, understanding, he had the dualism of God animating the whole, God being the spirit of the whole. Now God is the whole. Now God is the whole. And he sees that God is the whole, is not only a result, it's also an activity, which is the insight from Spinoza. Naturata, natura, naturans, activity, natura, naturata, result. And he gets the activity of the whole from that. And that is what he's been able to say, that the activity of the whole is what he names holism. Holism is the activity of the whole. I think I've said that. I can't get into more detail now, as much as I'd like to, but let me leave it there. So this is still 1909. In between his politics, he's writing this, all these notes. He eventually writes, the inquiry into the whole. And it's in the inquiry into the whole where he coins his word holism for the first time. The first ever document where he's written the word holism. I have in his notebook, and it's dated 1910. That's the first time holism appears in writing. And the purpose of writing his inquiry was once again to demonstrate his idea of God. And this is, in his search, is what I meant earlier on, that his discovery of holism was incidental to his search for God, because he finds God in the whole, and God is now holism. And his final chapter in the inquiry into the whole, he sets out a religious system based on his idea of the whole being God. Holism is God. So he sends his manuscript to his Cambridge professor friend Henry Wolstenholme, and the Cambridge professor reads only the first 3 chapters. He doesn't get to chapter 10, 11, and 12 and 13 of the inquiry, and he rejects what Smuts has to say, and he got stuck at the point where he found Smuts had made a fundamental error in his understanding of evolution. Very complicated now. I cannot get into that. But Wolstenholme didn't read the end part. He didn't read that the whole reason Smuts wrote the inquiry was to just demonstrate his idea of God and his new system of religion. A religion based on holism. A religion based on a life in holism, was Smuts's words. That was the summit of his inquiry. So from 1912, Smuts continues his endeavors. He goes to war in East Africa, not without his books, not without his papers, and at the foothills of Mount Kilimanjaro. And why we know that, it's not just a poetic expression. At the foothills of Mount Kilimanjaro, he writes a letter explaining how he's now realized the fault he made in the inquiry as far as evolution was concerned. And it's now clear to him. In any event, he leaves German East Africa, and he's going now to join the Imperial War Cabinet in London. And he stops over for a week on his way back to Irene to pick up his draft of the inquiry into the whole, and he takes it with him to London. And this period in London, and I know Professor Dupassani has also spent a lot of time studying that period, a very important period in Smuts's life. What I've been managed to discern is what role holism played. And in a chapter in my book, I refer to this period as a period where he tested holism in friendship and in faith. He was testing his holism all the time. He would spend many hours, many days with Margaret and with her sister, Alice Clark, discussing holism. And he would learn, and everything was in holistic language. Everything was in the language of the whole. He was a romantic kind of guy, and he was really taking advantage of these women in the United Kingdom who really fancied him quite a bit. And he was quite animated in his expressions of holism. in one of his many animated explanations of holism, he told Alice and Margaret that he was a mystic. And he says to them, what is holism, if not mysticism, pure and simple? I just thought I'd throw that in now for those that are thinking along those lines. Holism was a way, was an experience, it was a way of knowing. And that's what he meant. Smuts left London after being away from home for nearly 3 years, and with new insight, he was now ready to start again. He goes home in 1919, and Louis Botha, the prime minister, then suddenly dies in 1919, and Smuts is made prime minister. I think it's August or September 1919. And he's now prime minister. He would be prime minister up until 1924. But don't think that doesn't allow him time to settle down with his insight that he had from Mount Kilimanjaro between January and March of 1920. Remember, he's now prime minister. Between January and March 1920, he sits down to write, to start over. And the papers that we've accumulated, there are about 4 unfinished chapters and notes. He titles that Holism Again. I was surprised to find a recent paper written by a professional historian. It wasn't Professor Dupassani, who referred to Holism Again as the sequel to Holism and Evolution. Holism Again is not a sequel. It was written in between the inquiry and Holism and Evolution. So he abandons Holism Again, and the reason for abandoning it is now another epiphany. In December 1920, he reads the general theory of relativity for the first time. You would have thought he had read it earlier, but I found a letter between Margaret and himself where she had sent him these books and their communication. I was quite surprised. He had read the special theory of relativity around 1910. And there was indications in the inquiry where the language he uses to express the idea of matter as energy. So I could pick up in the inquiry that he had read the special relativity theory, which was written in 1905 by Einstein, but he hadn't read the general theory. And the general theory, where it all comes together for Smuts, space-time concepts, gravity and space-time, gravity curving space-time and so forth, all of that just falls into place for him, and he sees this new science is more holistic than he thought. And it changes everything for him, because his argument in the inquiry and before that, remember, he was looking for an idea of God and a solution and a scientific method of inquiry, because science was mechanistic. So the discovery now of the general theory shows him that science itself is becoming more spiritual. So his whole argument changes, and he has to change that for holism and evolution. He's now saying that despite your discoveries, you, the scientists, haven't understood the consequences. And then he's now, this is December 1920, he's immersed in all sorts of one political crisis after the other, and he really doesn't find the time to do any more work until he loses the general election in 1924, and then starts Holism and Evolution, having learned fundamental things. And one of the fundamental things he learned was when he was in London, when he was at Versailles, he asked, where is the God of holism now? That was critical, because for the first time, with the tragedy of World War, let me say the Great War, more correctly, where was Smuts's God of holism? That played a part in him abandoning his inquiry, as well as the theory of evolution, which he had to rework, and as well as his conceptual idea of the whole, which Alice Clark actually helped him refine. So that's the reason why he abandons the inquiry. So now let me answer the question of the sequel. For me now, after all the study, I realize it all falls into place. Can you see now that what happens is that the sequel to the application of holism to God and religion, to the higher spiritual interests of man, he's already dealt with that. It's in cosmic religion, it's in Whitman, it's in the inquiry. So when he comes to write Holism and Evolution, it's not as if he's saying, I want to address that in the future. He's saying, I cannot divulge that now because it's just too sensitive to even put on the table, because so much has happened since he originally started thinking along those lines. He's now, it's 1924, 1925. He's the leader of the opposition. He's the former prime minister. He was appointed the president to preside over the South African Association of Sciences meeting in 1925. He's involved with the science community. He wants to present holism as a scientifically strong concept. He cannot go now and pollute, for want of a better word, the scientific idea of God, of holism, with his idea of God. Hence, he leaves it out. So that answers my search for the sequel, for when he said in the preface, I want to deal with the application of holism to the higher spiritual interests of man. I won't go into details on this new religious system, but in essence, what Smuts was saying, what he's asking us to realize, and I'm going to use his words, the holism which operates outside of us is identical with the holism which is in us. And with that knowledge, we should live a life in holism and let universal holism realize its highest in you. And I'm now going to quote a small passage out of the inquiry. And he says, learn to be yourself with perfect honesty, integrity, and sincerity. Let universal holism realize its highest in you as a free whole of personality. And all the rest will be added unto you: peace, joy, blessedness, happiness, goodness, and all the other prizes of life. The echo of Matthew 6:33 is unmistakable for those that are biblical scholars. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. Where the gospel speaks of the kingdom of God, Smuts speaks of universal holism. The pattern is the same: align life with the highest order of reality, and the rest of life will fall into place. What I found extremely fascinating was that in chapter, I think it's 10 or 11 of Holism and Evolution, he reproduces the exact passage. You can go and look it up for yourselves now. It's on page 312 of the 3rd edition. But he frames the whole argument now as a solution to ethical and moral concerns, whereas in the inquiry, he framed it around a religious concern. So he used the same language, put it into Holism and Evolution. I just thought that's quite interesting. Right. So certainly, I'm sure you'll all agree that in conventional terms, Smuts's idea of God was rather radical. And his biographer, Keith Hancock, wrote in the 2-volume biography that he wrote on Smuts's life. He asked in the biography whether the inquiry was wicked. He used those exact words. Okay, I'm way over time, but I've got the best part. I have to share. So I don't know whether you want to let me carry on. If I don't carry on, you miss the whole punchline of my speech.
No, I can't bear to let you go now. You go.
I'm very honored to continue, and thank you for that. So here comes the crux now. So this is now getting back to the spiritual Smuts. He's written the inquiry, he's done all of that, he's decided, he's writing Holism and Evolution, he's leaving out the higher spiritual interests. We understand why he does that. But what he doesn't leave out when he writes Holism and Evolution is his deep spiritual point of view. That is, and his, of course, his spiritual method of inquiry, synthesis, that permeates the whole of Holism and Evolution. And so we finally get a clear sight of how his lifelong companionship with nature plays out in the way he formulates his definition of holism in Holism and Evolution. And here I have to read this, and I'm going to use Smuts's words in describing how I feel. Just follow me for a second. In Holism and Evolution, Smuts is quoting a passage on Darwin, and Smuts writes, he says, "I'm free to confess that there are few passages in the great literature of the world which affect me more deeply than these concluding words of Darwin." I'm using those words to say, I'm free to confess that there are few passages in the great literature of the world which affect me more deeply than these words of Smuts, which I'm about to share with you, in how he goes about defining his theory of holism. And he says, this is his method of discovering holism. He says, our object in studying, and this is in Holism and Evolution, page 93, 3rd edition. Our object in studying and interpreting nature is to be faithful to our experience of her. We do not want to recreate nature in our own image or abstract thought scheme. We do not wish to spread nature on a sort of Procrustes bed of our concepts and cut off here or there what appears surplus or unnecessary. In order to understand nature, we have to proceed more modestly, he says, and in closer touch with our ordinary observation of her ways. I wish to get as near as possible, Smuts says, to what one might call nature's point of view in our explanation of her. And in this way, we shall try to explain nature by reference to herself and her own standards, so to say, instead of by reference to intellectual abstractions of our own devising. Let us therefore proceed, says Smuts, in the way I propose, and try to reach a concept of nature which will not be imposed on her from without, but which will keep as close as possible to her own natural evolving units. Sure. This is how, and only how, holism can be revealed, as far as Smuts is concerned, by understanding nature's point of view. And what Smuts is really saying, experiencing nature's point of view. Holism, as Smuts came to define it, is an expression of nature's point of view. And both both his theory and his method. Nature's point of view was his method of inquiring into nature. Understand and experience her point of view are expressions of Smuts's deep spiritual point of view, which was nurtured out of nature. So if I can say this, if after 100 years, after Holism and Evolution, and if we celebrate anything, let us celebrate the idea of holism as an expression of nature's point of view. Now, you'd think I'd end my talk there, but I have more. So I haven't answered the second part, and I'm sure that part is vital, because we've answered the question of where he dealt with in the inquiry, his idea of God, but where's the details? Where is the details of how he explains how to live a life in holism? Where is that? We have that too. Can I carry on?
Go for it.
There are two parts to the sequel. Hello, Mark. I see you there. I'm carrying on, eh?
Carry on, carry on.
So where does Smuts tell us about the details of his religious solution? What does living a life in holism mean? Will we ever find out? And the answer is yes, we will, and we do. And where do we find it? In his letters to Margaret. Letters to Margaret is a title that I, at one point in time, considered for my book. That's how important Margaret Gellert, née Clark, was in his life. I have counted 1,756 letters written by Smuts to Margaret over a period of 44 years. 505 of these letters were either published in the 7-volume of Smuts's papers by Hancock and van der Poel, or were referenced by Hancock in his biography of Smuts. The other, that's less than a third, I traced every single other letter. I have both the holograph copy of Smuts's letter in his handwriting, and I have the copy typed up by Margaret. She typed up all his letters, especially for the biography for Hancock. Smuts treated these letters to Margaret as a form of a diary. He wrote at least one every week, and he told Margaret that one day he hoped that the world would discover what he meant by the religion of holism, and what it meant to let universal holism realize its highest in you. He also hoped that she would help distill and preserve all his thoughts. He even suggested she should consider a biography, but Sarah Gertrude Millen got in before her, and so forth. The letters to Margaret enables us to reconstruct what Smuts meant by living a life in holism, and it's detailed over a long period of time. So there's two persistent themes. When you study the letters, there's two persistent themes. There's one where Smuts describes what it's like to live a life of holism, what it meant to let a universal holism realize its highest in you. And another theme was his consistent reinterpretation of central doctrines of Christianity in the language of holism. And among many, there are many of these. Among them, there's a holistic interpretation of sin, of salvation, of resurrection, of the risen Christ, of incarnation, of immortality, of grace, of love, and faith itself. He takes each one of these Christian concepts, biblical concepts, and reinterprets them, gives it a holistic spin, because that was his aim, to find a new religion in holism, to replace the supernatural God, but retain the message, the spirituality of the Christian Bible, the message of Jesus. He called him the Prince of Love. That was so important to Smuts, but it needed, he said, a new language that could compete with science. So, among the many writers that influenced Smuts over a period of time, I thought I would just mention Albert Schweitzer, which is somebody that's not well known, but it played a very important part in Smuts's mature understanding, and in Smuts's interpretation, he used a lot of Albert Schweitzer. And then let me end off with this. To say that Smuts had this idea of God as holism, but he wasn't dogmatic. Smuts considered God as a mystery beyond human conception. And he did not claim to define the divine or God in any strict scientific or theological sense. But if pressed to speak about the nature of God, he would point to the divine nature of the personality. He sensed a pattern that connects. Smuts never used those words, but when he said the highest in man must bear some resemblance to the highest in divinity, that is what he meant. Personality is the universe expressing itself at its highest known level. Think about that. Can I repeat that? Personality is the universe expressing itself at its highest known level. This is Smuts's evolution theory. Therefore, self-conscious personality gives us the best available clue to whatever God is or does. A life in holism meant that the recognition that all things share a common origin and are bound together in the process of becoming, to live in awareness of holism, to be aware that the holism within you is the same holism in everything else, is and was for Smuts the essence of what a religious life should look like or should feel like. In this vision, religion was no longer a matter of belief in the supernatural, but of participation in the creative process of the whole, of holism. This was the basis on which Smuts hoped to rescue mankind from its spiritual failure, and he's hurting from the Great War. And he's now in the midst of a second war. Not by returning to older forms of religion, but by reawakening trust in the formative power that works through nature, mind, and personality. And in his words, to live a life in holism. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeff. I wonder if we might take a minute to be still, because you have given us such a rich view of a very long and extraordinary life. Thank you. Claudius.
Jeff, I found myself sitting on the edge of my chair. I found myself holding my breath from time to time. And I'm deeply grateful. So I just want to open the space to whoever, just to respond. Maybe not even question, just respond. What's happening for you? Stick up your hand.
J-Mind.
Mhm.
J-Mind.
Who?
You can't see everybody.
I'd like to respond to that, Jeff.
Go.
What an extraordinary and emotional and beautiful rendition and interpretation of an extraordinary life. I feel deeply moved, and I've learned so much. I'm really extraordinarily grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Yeah, I also am sitting here and I think it sounds like Smuts is writing to us here in the time that we are living. Because I quite often find that when things seem to fall apart, they actually fall in place. And I think that is what the belief in holism means. It is, as we heard yesterday, it brings hope. Today, I heard that it also brings love, because love is the logic of unity, of reconciliation, of bringing together. And I don't think that is really possible when we are trapped in our two-valued logic
John Anderson.
between our ears. That muscle is not really able to come to grips with the richness of this. And again, love as synthesis. Love brings together. And what you highlighted today and what I appreciated is that this is not a mental construct. Spirit is not a mental, it is a deep, deep existential experience. And unless one go there through and become vulnerable in your mind, between your ears, you may never really experience holism. And I wrote a note here that I say that holism for me is not a state or a condition, but it is a process, a continuous process towards an unfolding unity in the world that is broken. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
John Anderson. Are you there, John?
He's on mute. Tell him he's on mute. There you go.
Hello? Hello,
Okay.
can you hear me?
Yes. Go, John.
You can. Okay, I just want to thank Jeff very, very much indeed for a brilliant overview of Jan Smuts and holism. I won't go much further than that. Other than to say it's fantastic that it coincides, 1926 coincides with the birth of David Attenborough, Sir David Attenborough, who is the optimal fellow of describing biodiversity on planet Earth. Coincidence between David Attenborough and Jan Smuts. I absolutely love it.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Biodiversity. Thanks again, Jeff. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
By the way, John will be presenting into the future. John is a paleobotanist, and he's going to be presenting. Mark.
Yeah, thank you. That's absolutely fascinating. Thanks for that lovely comment, John. Actually, it's quite thought-provoking about David Attenborough being born at the same time that the what was that the book was launched.
1926.
Oh, wow, what a beautiful synchronicity.
Yeah.
I was just interested about, this Smuts in order to live the religion of holism, as he put it, encouraging us to have a point of view of the universe from nature's perspective. And I was just wondering, how on earth does one do that?
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. Joshua.
Could you read out Professor Quibus's comment?
Yes. So Quibber says, you are the real expert on Smuts' thinking as expressed in his writings. Magnificent.
Thank you so much for that comment. That is, I felt as though I was presenting to you tonight, Professor, my doctorate that you would sponsor. But I'll do a book. Perhaps you would be kind enough to read it for my publishers, or even publish it for me. I would love to collaborate with you in some way. Thank you for that very nice comment.
Yeah. I saw your hand. Thank you. I saw your hand, Joshua.
Okay, thank you. Just to say, yeah, deeply moved by your presentation, Jeff. It wasn't simply the depth of your research and your insight, but actually it was you modeling what Smuts was actually speaking about. That is to say, you are living a life of holism in the way that you engage with his work and that you present it to here. And my hope is that this project that Claudius has inspired in us all will take his work and your work forward. So thank you again.
Very much.
Joshua.
Could I, Claudius?
Yes.
Could I just acknowledge my my sister, who is in New York? There she is. My family, my wife and my daughter. I don't know if my other daughter in New York is on the call, but they have lived.
She is, Jeff. She's there. Hi, boy.
Okay. No, they have lived with me, with Smuts, for at least 12 years. And they are living this life in holism with me and with Smuts. So they are part of this journey that I've been on. And I want to thank them, and particularly my wife, Bridget, for staying with me through this time.
Beautiful. Marcus?
Yes, I just wanted to add the experience that, in a way, you've modeled what Smuts was doing when he was reading Goethe and Whitman's life. You have read Smuts's life, and that really tickled me and touched me, that you went into it with such enthusiasm. You know, I think that you called yourself an amateur historian, but you're a professional on another level. You know, there's and it's the wrong word, because your boundless enthusiasm didn't have any constraints. You could follow the passion of the work that unfolded as you were doing it, itself a fractal of holism and so forth. So a really fantastic experience to see that bubble up in you, going off on so many tangents and bringing it back together. Can I have another 5 minutes, Claudius? Just to explain holism. Thank you, Jeff. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Wow. So, any queries or questions specifically on what Jeff presented? And Jeff, I think what we might do is to actually schedule a specific interactive time around what you presented. We'll find a gap, because what you was so rich, and I suspect there's so much that's there. So I'm just calling on any other further observations or comments or questions. Put your hand up.
Claudius?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Could I just ask on a more historical level, when you talked about the spiritual awakening of Smuts in the late 1890s, so when he was still young, in my own studies, I realized that it was in that same time that all over the world there was a spiritual awakening. of a rediscovering of the work of the Holy Spirit. And, churches, and it was not a very intellectual process, but a lot of miracles happened, etc., etc. I don't want to go, and there's a lot of written. Now, it is interesting that it is in the same time that he came to the awakening of the spiritual dimension of what eventually became holism. Did you do any studies? Is there any references to him? I know in South Africa, there was also in 1906, actually a beginning of that and so forth, the whole spiritual dimension that eventually became the charismatic movement in the 60s. And so is there anything about that in his books, or is it more the...
I didn't find any connection to that, no.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Egon.
Okay.
Egon?
Yeah, just very practical, because Saturday we have a panel discussion with all the presenters, and that can well be a good place to also take the questions that we now might have also over there.
Yes. Thank you for that observation. So just to remind us that the presenters are going to be gathering on Saturday morning after Dr. Jude Caravan has made a presentation, after David Lorimer has made they'll get together.
David's here.
And David has left already.
Oh, is he?
And then Marcus, of course, is tomorrow. So Marcus will be there. So I think it's just to back to Michael to do the thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Claudius. I will keep this quite brief. If I may thank Jeff again for his deep research into Smuts' writings, looking for an idea of God to replace the supernatural, and the question for us all, how to live in companionship with nature, our brothers and our sisters, and to feel or see the unseen, and to have a new idea of God that can stand up to science, holism as mysticism, and finally, nature's point of view. Nature's point of view is the phrase which will stay with me. So thank you very much, Jeff, on behalf of all of us, and thank you all for your time and your great company and deep attention. And as I said yesterday, thank you especially to Claudius and Michelle and the core team, who extraordinarily, with great generosity and energy and good spirit, have brought us this wonderful time. Tomorrow, it's the same time and the same place to join Marcus Link in his presentation, which I am deeply looking forward to, wonderfully entitled Keystones and Pattern of Place, and how, so importantly, he asks, we may leave a wake of regeneration. Looking forward. So, safe journeys all. See you tomorrow. Bye for now.